So my presentation is on the ethical considerations in the use of induced pluripotent stem cells and methods of balancing innovation and responsibility. So, for centuries, humans have been wondering about immortality. Is it inevitable, or is it inevitable that we all have to die? In the future, would it be possible to perhaps cheat death, prolong life, and live forever? Some research currently is actually looking into that. So the quest for immortality in modern times can be seen in genetic engineering. We can use CRISPR-Cas9 to modify genes that control aging, therefore slowing down the process of aging and mortality. As well, nanotechnology can be used to fix molecules in the nanoscale that go wrong inside the body. And cryonics is a very cool topic as well. It's a preservation technique to transport you into the future. It's like a time machine, and then you can use the futuristic medicine to save yourself if you're already about to die. Mind uploading is quite far as of now still, and what that is just basically scanning the entire brain and then putting it into a brain-computer interface so it can be downloaded later on. And there are some really cool species out there, like certain jellyfish species that actually exhibit biological immortality. They will not die unless they're killed. So maybe we can research those genes and what makes them immortal and then implement that into humans. And last but not least is stem cells. Now, stem cells is not exactly a means of achieving immortality. It's approach for regenerative medicine, but I mention it in this slide because it can possibly be used to get to immortality in the future. So what exactly are stem cells? So stem cells are unspecialized cells that have the capability to develop into several different types of cells of any body cell type that we have. And they have a remarkable potential to proliferate and regenerate themselves. So in this figure, you can see that they can become any cell in the body. As well, they regenerate themselves, make a copy before they commit to changing, so that that one can keep doing the same. So they never run out. So there are some types of stem cells, and they come in stages. So we have pluripotent, so that is a human zygote. It can turn into all cells, including the cells that are required for implantation and giving rise to fetus inside the placenta and all of that. Those are called the extraembryonic cells. Like the umbilical cord is not required for the individual, but it's definitely required for the development of the individual. Pluripotent stem cells can differentiate into most types of cells, but not those extraembryonic cells. But they have the capability to actually develop an organism after they're provided with the extra cells. And then more specific, oligopotent can only become a few types of cells, like in the same lineage, like the same type. So for example, the lymphoid stem cell can become any white blood cell. And then the unipotent cell can only turn into one cell. So it's just regenerating cells as they get deteriorated. So these are the embryonic stem cells. We have these are the stages of development, and then the zygote and the morula are totipotent, and then once they become the blastula and further the gastrula, they're pluripotent. And all of these are very useful in stem cell research and medicine. And then we have somatic stem cells. Somatic stem cells are found in adult bodies, and they regenerate the cells as they die. So here are some cool examples of some of the things that somatic stem cells do. So your entire intestinal lining gets replaced every 4 days. White blood cells replace themselves every 13 days. Red blood cells live a little bit longer, 120 days. So every single day, there are 330 billion cells that are getting turned over, which is 1% of your entire cell count. And then it can also help regenerate damaged or missing tissue. And this is a picture of Prometheus. He stole fire from the gods to give it to humans, and then because he committed a crime, Zeus punished him, chaining him to this mountain, and then every single day an eagle would come and eat his liver, part of his liver. And because of stem cells, the liver would regenerate every night, and then the eagle would come back and eat it again. So it represents eternal torment, but what I'm trying to get at here is that stem cells are responsible for the regeneration of tissue and organs. So some applications of stem cells currently are in regenerative medicine and in research. So in medicine, you can treat like missing cells, damaged cells with stem cells to recover skin cells in burn victims, for example, nerve cells even in spinal cord injuries. Nerve cells don't tend to recover by itself too often, but with stem cells they can recover very easily. Retinal eye cells that are degenerated in things like macular degeneration can also be recovered. And then for cancer treatment, there's bone marrow transplants for leukemia and other ways to treat cancer. And in the future, there's a potential for organ transplantation. You can grow full organs with stem cells and transplant them into patients. And then in research, you can use stem cells to model complex diseases at the cellular level. You can culture these stem cells and see where the genetic diseases come from. And then you can also use pharmaceuticals on human cells instead of using animal cells, and then see the effects. You can culture as many stem cells as you want. And then you can also understand human development, causes of birth defects, and developmental disorders by conducting research on stem cells. But obviously there are some significant challenges as well, and some ethical considerations. So stem cells, are embryonic stem cells at least, have different DNA, and they have the risk of immune rejection. Because you're putting a different DNA into your body might not like it, might not accept it. And then controlling how these stem cells differentiate once it's inside the patient can be difficult, because for the most part, we have a general understanding of how these cells differentiate, but the specific details and the transcription factors required are still, for the majority, unclear. And just in the case that you have uncontrolled proliferation, guess what? You have tumors, because stem cells resemble cancer cells very closely with the unlimited potential to regenerate. And the biggest concern for ethics is that embryos must be sacrificed for embryonic stem cell collection. So if you take like the zygote or the morula, even the blastula cells from there, chances are that the embryo will die so that you can use the stem cells in your research or in medical applications. A potential solution to many of these challenges and ethical considerations is induced pluripotent stem cells. But to understand how those work, we need to first understand how stem cells differentiate generally. So stem cells generally differentiate in a linear fashion, as in they get more specific through the stages. So all cells have the same DNA, but as you know, we are made of multiple different cells that do different things. And how does that work? That happens because of gene expression. All cells have the same DNA, but different parts of the DNA are expressed, and that is controlled by transcription factors. And as stem cells differentiate, they specialize, these genes are getting turned off so that they become more and more specialized, and they can only do one thing at a time. And then this is just the flow chart of how they become specialized. And then that arrow right there is how induced pluripotent stem cells would work, and I'll explain that right now. So induced pluripotent stem cells were invented by Shinya Yamanaka, who won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2012, just about 10 years ago now. And what he discovered were the Yamanaka factors. So the Yamanaka factors are four specific genes that he found that if he activated them in adult somatic cells, they would become pluripotent. So these are the four genes, they're just important transcription factors. And what he did was that he virally injected them into bodily cells, like somatic cells, like skin cells. And then with these four genes reactivated, or not reactivated, but overexpressed in the on format, then they became pluripotent all over again. So what are the benefits and the risks of these induced pluripotent stem cells? So the benefits is mainly you don't have to sacrifice an embryo to get the effects of them, and you can just take them from the skin cell of a person. And it's your DNA. If you want to put it back into your body, there is no risk of rejection, unless obviously there's some genetic manipulations. And you have to consider that the viral injections does change the genome a little bit, so there might be a small chance that it doesn't recognize itself. And then it's much more readily available than embryonic stem cells because you don't have to wait at fertility clinics and you don't have to get the approval of other people to use their embryos. You can just take it from your skin. The risks, obviously there's always some risks. So the viral transduction, as I said, it does incorporate extra genes into the genome, which may have problems with DNA replication and may even cause some cancers. So one of the Yamanaka factors that I mentioned in the last slide, c-MYC, is a proto-oncogene. So if it's incorporated into the wrong place, then it can proliferate other cells and create cancers. And high risk of abnormal or incomplete reprogramming with such a novel technique, viral transduction. It's a very brute force method, and there's still some kinks to iron out. So where do these cells take us? So regenerating damaged tissue and organs, so you can, like the embryonic stem cells, you can regenerate your macular retinal cells as well as your skin cells, whatever you need, but it does have your own DNA. And this has been successful in clinical trials as a treatment for macular degeneration treatment already, and then treatment for heart disease, diabetes, and spinal cord injury are still in progress and show great promise. And then another aspect is lab-grown organs and body parts for transplantation. So you can potentially program these stem cells to grow a full organ or even an arm or something in the future, not right now. And you can implant that back to yourself, and then obviously again, no risk of rejection. And you can, this is why I mentioned immortality at the beginning, you can replace these organs as they degenerate. So if your heart is failing, you can have a surgeon take it out, put your heart back in, but it's fresh, brand new. So if you keep replacing your cells over and over, then you may have unlocked immortality. But way off in the future still at this point. And then one of the biggest implications of stem cells is in research. So with induced pluripotent stem cells, because they have your DNA, you can actually model the diseases exactly to your phenotype. So you don't have to rely on a general model of that disease. You can literally see how it works in your own cells in a petri dish. And in pharmaceutical research, you can apply drugs to your own cells instead of other people's cells, other animal cells, and see how that affects your cells. So way more personalized. Yeah. And then another really interesting thing that I found about these induced pluripotent stem cells is the capacity to clone genetically identical organisms. So this sounds science fiction, but it's not, because mice have already been cloned. So, and they're fertile through the second generation. And yeah, so we all know what happens when we take a genetically identical zygote of ourselves and implant it into the uterus. We get an identical twin. So we can use that same logic and make identical copies of ourselves or animals with induced pluripotent stem cells. But what are the ethics of all of this? Oh, one thing I quickly forgot to mention is that this would be amazing in laboratory science because you can produce genetically identical lab animals, and then they would eliminate a lot of the confounding variables in research. But the ethical questions are more important. So here are some questions that I would like to discuss as a group, but I'll just introduce them right now. So iPSCs are pluripotent. They can potentially give rise to a full organism, just like we saw in those mice, with the example of cloning, as long as you provide the right supports. So should they be subject to the same ethics as an embryo? Because they could potentially become a full organism, just like in a fertilized embryo. But do they get different rights because of how they were produced? Fertilization of an ovum is a miracle of life, but these cells are produced in a test tube with viral injections. Do they get different rights because of it, but even if they're functionally the same thing? And then this could be analogous to sacrificing many lives to save one life. So if you're trying to achieve that immortality that I mentioned, and you're consistently replacing organs as they deteriorate, you're potentially getting rid of your own embryos with multiple embryos to save your own life, so multiple sacrifices to save one life. Although again, it's the question of, do these count as real embryos? And then cloning could also become a means of reproduction for infertile or homosexual couples. So if you can't have babies, guess what? You can just take skin cells and then turn them into embryos and then have a baby that way. But and then you can also genetically engineer these embryos to either match your partners or just give them variation. Again, also there is a possibility of designer babies here. You can manipulate the genes of an embryo and then see what happens. And then, so imagine a society where these clones are accepted and they're allowed and people are able to reproduce that way. And if we're still continuing to use these induced pluripotent stem cells in medicine and research, what does that say about the role of the clones? Are they just there to serve us? Or do they have their own livelihood? And if you're a clone baby and you see that other clones like you are literally being generated and used to fix other people, how would that make you feel? And would that influence your role in society? And yeah, these are some questions I have, and that's the end of my presentation. I am happy to take questions or discuss these points further.
So, you know, there are urgent ethical questions, and then there are sort of theoretical ethical questions that nobody's really facing or forced to confront that, you know, are things that just seem less urgent. And some of these things are in that category, right? You know, like saying that a pluripotent stem cell should have the same rights as an embryo. I don't know that anybody's arguing that yet.
I have found sources that have argued it, and they check if these embryos are viable before they use them.
Yeah. Okay.
But mainly the use of the current ethical questions are these ones, so the embryos sacrificing. So I will talk about how, like what kind of ethical perspectives they use. So if you're willing to sacrifice embryos to help yourself, it's not really, like if you look at it from a deontological perspective, you're kind of not doing the embryo justice if you give the embryo moral rights, and you're not giving it autonomy. Non-maleficence, not sure about that because they can't feel pain, but obviously it's leading to the demise without their consent. And in current, but like, just to go back to this one, you can use consequentialist perspectives because it is giving the person a chance again. But again, the consequences are that a new baby is not being born. So that's also a little gray. Depends on how much moral rights you give the baby. So that is the current ethical considerations. And then for the iPSCs being considered an embryo, those can get into more like theoretical ethics, like you mentioned. And pretty much what I wanted to say about that is that it's more of like a communitarian maybe, because you can look at the relationship between the embryo and the person. So because the embryos are literally from the person, maybe they have an obligation to fill the person's will. So that's pretty much how they're justifying it now, but in papers that I have read, they're still a little hesitant on using these that are viable because they can potentially become people.
Yes. So it's amazing over time how customs and ethics have changed. You know, several hundred years ago, you could challenge somebody to a duel. It was perfectly legal. I forget exactly how it works, but you would take a glove and slap them and, then agree where you were going to meet for the duel, and, and each would try to shoot the other. Yeah. So we don't do that anymore, right? But at the time it seemed somehow perfectly logical, right? So you kind of wonder how many perfectly logical things we're doing right now that was not so logical later on. And I think that so many more things are going to be possible. And I really see it as a role of young people. Ordinarily, we think of leaving the big decisions to older people, but I really think some of this stuff, it would be good if young people kind of stepped up and said, well, it seems to me that although this is possible, we shouldn't do it, and whereas these other things are obviously desirable and possible, and we should do it, So I'm interested in what you think about the role of young people decision making in general or in this area. Does that make sense to you, or is it your internal feeling that you would turn to older people, wrinkled, wise, old people that make these decisions? What seems best to you?
I think young people can bring innovative ideas that the older generation hasn't thought of, but it's also important to acknowledge their wisdom. So I think while young people should be very active in these decisions, it should be more collaborative between all ages of people, so
Yeah.
everybody's wisdom can be there. But you're right, young people shouldn't just have apathy and be like, oh, those guys are in charge, they should take care of it. They should still be informed, even though they're not directly required to by their government or their position in society. They should still learn independently so that they can influence the older people making decisions, as well assume that role once they're more competent.
Yeah, and I think somehow in making these decisions, you influence what the deal is for being a young person, right? Like, is it a lot of fun, or is it really painful and like you feel, when I'm in any agency, you can't control anything and sort of powerless, and yeah. So, because that has also changed very much, this idea of whether being young is really good or terrible or in between.
I think to be young is, you're like a trial and error period. You can make as many mistakes as you want, and people will forgive you for that. So it's your time to make mistakes, learn from them, so in the future you know what not to do. So I think being young with that way to get away with, or ability to take risks, is very cool, and you better make the most of it while you're young before
Right.
people.
But taking crazy risks will also be possible in the future. Like, if you get killed, you can just activate a clone of yourself, and maybe you've missed a few hours, but you'll just keep on going, and yeah, so then there's a whole issue of finding meaning in life, right? Where does meaning come from? Well, if everything's negotiable, there are no absolutes, right? If everything is like dependent upon the situation and so on, it's a lot easier if there are rules, right? But you don't want everything to be bound by arbitrary rules. Yeah. So it's hard to know what is the most desirable situation.
I think if in a world where immortality is possible, people will have to redefine the meaning of life. It changes person to person and even through timelines. So 100 years ago, meaning of life may be very different from meaning of life right now.
Yeah. Even the meaning of friendship, like you often hear people talk about growing old together, right? Well, maybe in the future you wouldn't be growing old, right?
Staying young together.
Yeah, staying young together, yeah. So, anyway, many thought-provoking ideas. Okay, well, thank you very much. And now what I will do is